Castigation of Kshatriyas. When the Loyalists entered the erratic binary star system of Laptan, their fears were soon realized. Above the feral world of Kshatriyas and a ragged armada of star vessels, scows, and wrecks have been assembled from scavenged hulks and pirated freight, while OPEX scans and auger probes revealed that on the planet below, vast camps and training grounds had been raised up. Here on Kshatriyas, a new army was being forged from brutal and tainted tribal warriors enslaved to the Tyrant of Badab's cause, a disposable weapon to kill and be killed at Huron's will. Mirsan deduced that the bulk of the enemy warships were away on some mission of plunder. There would not be a better time to strike. Swiftly, the venerable Salamander's commander configured a bold attack plan. The joint Astarte strike force made planetfall and immediately attacked the secessionist bastions and training camps. In the meantime, their ships and naval escort immediately swept out again and set about destroying the armada as swiftly as thoroughly as possible. When the two chapters launched their drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships, they divided their chosen killing grounds. Though they met with a firmer resistance than their Salamander cousins, the Minotaurs were masters of siegecraft, as they attacked the iron-shod bastions of the Astral Claws. Using their Thunderhawks to punch a gap in the enemy's firing lines, the gunship disgorged assault Terminators and Devastator squads directly into the smoking wreckage. The rest of the company's strong Minotaur's force deployed directly behind this breaking point, suffering the brunt of the enemy's counterattack. Despite heavy casualties, the Minotaur's vanguard veterans held the ruined bastion with disciplined ferocity, not giving an inch of ground to the oncoming secessionists. The bronze-armored Minotaurs clashed in brutal close combat with the Astral Claws retaliators, who advanced under cover of their combat shields, through a hail of bolter fire to try to retake the sundered fortifications, only to be hurled back time and again from the mount of a twisted metal and shattered rockcrity. I don't know what that is. Although in numbers, the Minotaurs and the defending Astral Claws at the bastion line were roughly equal, the enemy was well entrenched and well armed and well led, lacking nothing for bravery and fighting spirit. But the Minotaurs were masters of siegecraft, and this blood-soaked close-quarter hell was exactly the kind of battlefield in which they revealed. Led by an armored spearhead of land raiders and siege dreadnoughts, the Astral Claws were pinned in place by the Minotaur's second attack line. Chaplain Enkomi personally led a jump-pack equipped vanguard veteran squad in storming the secondary enemy bastion and slaying all within. Encircled and cut off, the Astral Claws were swiftly isolated and destroyed in detail. Though their progress was slow and bloody, the secessionists could not stem the loyalist advance. The Astral Claws made them pay a price in dead for every fortification the Minotaurs took. But inevitably, the bastions fell one by one, and victory was acclaimed by the Minotaurs. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Salamander's force descended on the heart of the city-sized training camps. A secondary force composed of a chosen wing of Caestus assault rams, carrying aboard them a force of Salamanders, Fire Drake's Terminators, the greatest warriors of their esteemed chapter, took on the task of attacking the secessionists' landing grounds. On their first pass, the armored prows and magna meltas of the Caestus savaged the enemy transport craft caught on the ground, sundering and burning through their hulls, rupturing their fuel tanks. The fire drakes, assaulting from their craft into the billowing black palls of smoke, turned confusion and destruction into a massacre, their storm bolters and cyclone missile launchers sweeping the panicked foe away before any resistance could be organized. Elsewhere, the main Salamander's force, led by Captain Mirsan, had descended into the heart of the enemy, deploying their troops and armor into a defensive ring at the center of the training camps. Utterly surrounded, the Salamander's force at under 100 Space Marines was outnumbered more than 1,000 to 1 by the horde of savages and mutants, the brutal inhabitants of a dozen nearby worlds that rose up before them. Though their position would have been considered a suicidal one by any other warriors, these were the scions of Vulcan, and they cared little for such odds. The great horde, which was leaderless and staggered by the sudden fury and shock of the Salamander's assault, were slow to react, and by the time they pressed the attack, they were met by a wall of firepower. Thousands of heretics fell within the opening minutes of the battle as whirlwind launchers, predator destructors, and the ordered ranks of the Salamanders let loose with a salvo at almost point-blank range. Soon the broken ground of the training fields was covered with mounds of twitching bodies. The horde only rallied when their taskmasters took the field behind them, the blood-stained steel-colored power armor of Astral Claws. The Salamanders marked their true foe in the form of retaliator squads amidst the filthy rabble of the heretic horde, keeping up their relentless tide of fire. Mirsan sprang the second phase of his assault plan into action, as three prize Land Raider Achilles spearheaded a counter-assault aimed directly at the Astral Claws contingent. The tanks fired their Thunderfire cannons, and multiple meltas blasting a swath through the ranks of the horde. As the Land Raiders plowed through the center of the Astral Claws force, they swung aside as the fury of the Ancients was unleashed. 6 dreadnoughts led by the darkly famed Briart Ashmantle, the Iron Dragon, stormed into Astral Claws lines, smashing them asunder and drenching them with purifying flame. Overmatched and overwhelmed, the Astral Claws did not yield lightly, but were slain in glorious combat, felling 2 of the Salamander's Ancients. As the last Astral Claws died, the name of the Tyrant of Badab was hallowed with their Centurion's dying breath as the Iron Dragon tore him in half and cast his carcass to the winds. With their master slaughtered, the horde panicked and broke, the tens of thousands that remained alive fleeing in a mindless stampede away from the lords of fire and death at their backs, crushing and killing hundreds more of their own numbers in the rout. Deep beneath the smashed fortification, the Minotaurs and the Salamanders soon discovered what secrets they were built to defend. A vast natural cavern system housing heretic laboratories. These had been manufacturing combat drugs in vast quantities and attempting primitive gene tampering and experimental surgery on the feral warriors of Shaprias, along with hundreds of Imperial prisoners taken in the raids across the eastern Maelstrom zone. At the lowest levels, guarded by a cadre of the hated corpse-taker apothecaries of the Tyrant's Legion and their servitors, was an armored vault within which was a store of Space Marine gene seed, in part stolen from loyalists fallen in battle. The conflict in orbit had also gone in the loyalists' favor, while the battle raged below, but not without a cost. While the makeshift armada had been blasted to scrap and burning debris, concealed weapons platforms set to guard the fleet had inflicted damage to the Pyre of Glory, and gutted the sword-class frigate Epona, which had been abandoned as a burning hulk. Less than 11 solar days after the battle was first joined, the Gift of Fire task force departed the Laptan system to undertake the perilous voyage back to Loyalist-held space. With over 1,000 free prisoners carried in the holds of its naval light cruisers, and the priceless recovered gene seed held in the inner sanctum of the Pyre of Glory itself. The gift of fire had claimed a great victory for the Loyalists and uncovered and thwarted a dark machination of the Tyrants that it felt to hatch could have... Wait, I have to redo this. The gift of fire had claimed a great victory for the Loyalists and uncovered and thwarted a dark machination of the Tyrants that if left to hatch could have had dire consequences for the Imperium. Little did any in the Loyalist high command suspect, however, that the attack at Laptown would have immediate and unforeseen consequences that would unexpectedly alter the course of the Badab War. The Red Hour. The Gift of Fire task force was unexpectedly struck by a powerful warp squall and scattered en route back to Imperial-controlled space. Calamity was averted by the formidable skill of their lead navigator, and only a single frigate was lost to the Immaterium, while the Salamander's battle barge, Pyre of Glory, and the light cruiser, Admiral Gregorius, were turned back into the Maelstrom, riding ahead of the Stormfront, and forced to ford into real space, and the relative stability of the Kallax Shohals within the Maelstrom's boundary to repair and refit. The Loyalists' arrival had not gone unnoticed, for soon news of their presence was carried to the Successionists. The Astral Claw strike cruiser Hyrcania was still in the region, having found its home base on Shaprias destroyed. Its master, Arch-Centurion Karnak Commodus, craved vengeance and atonement for his fallings in the eyes of his lord. But Commodus knew that alone his vessel stood little chance on taking on the wounded Loyalists. He sent an encrypted astropathic message seeking aid. Seeking aid was received by an unexpected ally in the Phantom's Wrath, flagship battle barge of the Executioner's chapter, and her accompanying Gladius-class frigate escorts, which had been taking on supplies at the inhabited ocean world of Deluge, on the edge of the Magog cluster. Their combined battle group attacked the wounded Loyalist vessels as they moved toward the warp transfer point at Kalach to embark once again. The light cruiser Admiral Gregorius was blasted to atoms in the opening salvo of the Successionist guns. The Pyre of Glory quickly proved to be far less easy prey. The Salamander's mighty battle barge managed to repel the first boarding assaults against her and destroy 2 of the attacking frigates. But after a 3-hour-long running battle, the Phantom's Wrath managed to entirely disable the Pyre of Glory's thrusters, leaving it dead in space. High Mortiurge, which refers to High Chaplain, Tusla Kane Vox signaled the Salamander's vessel and offered them the chance for honorable surrender, vouching safe passage for them from the war zone under oath not to take up arms again in the conflict. Captain Pelas Mirsan conceded to this demand, despite the misgivings of some of those under his command, knowing that to do so would risk his force being destroyed without being able to strike back at their foe. Having himself fought alongside the Executioner's chapter centuries before as a scout marine neophyte, he trusted to their oath of offered surety. Both the Phantom's Wrath and Hyrcania drew alongside the battered Pyre of Glory and docked. Tusla Kane personally leading the Executioners, a boarding party, and accepting Mirsan's sword in surrender, as the Salamanders stood down their arms. It was then elsewhere within the great ship the unthinkable occurred. Thanks to the conditions of the surrender, Arch-Centurion Commodus led his own boarding party to seize the Pyre of Glory's armories, nearly unopposed. Heedless of the consequences, Commodus sought to breach the ship's sanctum vaults and seize not only the recovered gene seed from the caverns of Shaprias, but also the Salamander's own recovered stock from the fatality sustained during the conflict. When the Salamander's apothecaries resisted, Commodus cut them down. He then unleashed his unfettered wrath upon the salamanders, ordering the massacre of the salamanders they had taken prisoner. He then ordered his corpse takers to strip them of their gene seed, whether alive or dead. A pitched battle quickly broke out across the decks. As reports reached the bridge of what was happening, Tuslakin was incensed with murderous rage. Seeing this reaction, Mirsan wisely divined that the executioners may not have posed full knowledge of the heresy and blasphemy committed by the astral claws, perhaps having been deliberately deceived by the Tyrant of Badab. Controlling his own outrage, Mirsan poured deliberate scorn on the executioner's leader, both for this breach of his word and the dishonor of standing by and allowing the tyrant's sins to go unchallenged. With the reports of his executioner's own eyes giving the gravity of truth to Mirsan's claims, Cain's wrath was terrible to behold. He declared that the blood oath binding his chapter to Huron's cause had been violated, and the dark stain of infamy the astral claws had brought upon them could only be washed clean by a river of blood. Those salamander battle brothers that have survived what was to come have since given witness that the bleak madness came upon the executioners at Cain's pronouncement, and that they tore into the astral claws with a murderous vengeance, heedless of the risk to their own lives, satisfied only that their former allies would die by their hands, regardless of the cost. Captain Mirsan rallied his surviving salamander's brethren and mounted the defense of the battle barge's inner sanctum, unleashing the power of the mighty ancients, the dreadnought, led by Breyart Ashmantle, the Iron Dragon, of course, upon the apostate astral claws. First, the corridors and vaults of the Pyre of Glory, and then the astral claws Hykernia ran red with blood. This dreadful battle became known in the legends as the Red Hour, as every single astral claw, chapter serf, and servitor present was relentlessly hunted down and slaughtered. The Hykernia was left a carnal house of decapitated bodies, as the executioners took more than 200 heads from their former allies. Tuslakin came alone before the Salamander's commander, Captain Mirsan, and knelt in the light of the burning sanctum's braziers. Offering him no words, he presented a single gory object which rolled at Miran's feet, the head of the astral claw's arch-centurion, Commodus. Without further comment, the executioners withdrew, leaving the stricken Salamander's battle barge and the empty astral claw's strike cruiser docked alongside. The executioner's maddened desire for vengeance had not been saturated, and soon his message reached every corner of the Maelstrom zone. From this point onward, the executioner's chapter became a rogue element in the conflict, not only seeking out and descending with suicidal fury on the astral claws and their agents wherever they could be found, but also refusing to surrender to loyalist forces when encountered. The most notorious incident of this kind occurred when the executioners deployed the Sons of Medusa strike cruiser. The most notorious incident of this kind occurred when the executioners destroyed the Sons of Medusa strike cruiser Warspite and the Grief system in 911. But there were other incidents as well. Beyond these lamentable incidents, the executioner's chapter's attacks on wider imperial shipping ceased almost immediately. These unusual developments were only explained some solar months later, when the badly wrecked Pyre of Glory finally limped into port at the Loyalist battle station at Cerngrad, with their strange and bloody tale to tell. For the Tyrant of Badab's cause, there could have been no more bitter blow than that struck by these allies turned enemies. Not only had the serving of the executioners from the Successionists robbed Huron's forces of much of its remaining strength in warships and raider craft, but as foes the executioners were both impeccable and had the advantage of detailed knowledge of many of the Successionists' hidden bases and deployments, which they put to immediate use in destroying them. When first the Lamenters and the Mantis warriors shorn from the successionist order of battle, with first the Lamenters and then the Mantis warriors shorn from the successionist order of battle, and almost barely the executioners turned against him, Huron and what remained of his once mighty astral claws were truly alone before the Imperium's wrath. Their dreams of dominion and eternal glory shattered. The Tyrant stands alone. An order for death. Following what he regarded as the treachery of his former allies, Huron announced in a recorded message that was relayed throughout the war zone that the astral claws and their subjects no longer were part of the Imperium of Man. Up until this point, although the Badab successionists had been declared heretic by the Imperium, within the worlds they had controlled, the pattern of established life had gone on much as it had for many centuries, and the worship of the God Emperor had been maintained. Those Adeptus Ministorum prelates that had overtly disagreed with the successionists had been removed and replaced with those more amiable to the Tyrant of Badab's cause, and millions still followed their faith unimpeded, while the Badab sector's native defenders believed naturally enough that they fought and died in a battle against heresy, rather than in its name. But now the truth was no longer concealed from the pitiable masses of the sector. Within Huron's remaining domains, all signs and symbols of imperial authority, culture, and religious creed were cast down in a firestorm of iconoclasm. The mass executions on Badab primaris of ecclesiarchy clerics and functionaries, most of whom remained largely ignorant of the true cause and nature of the conflict, was said to last for solar weeks without pause. Reports from inquisitorial agents that had infiltrated the Badab sector reported at this time that conditions on its principal world grew ever harsher, famine and want commonplace, and despair's shadow fell over all. As for the astral claws themselves, although the practice was by no means universal, many of the Battle Brothers began to deface any semblance of imperial heraldry and insignia from their armor and war gear, scouring it to bare metal or daubing it in reds and crimsons in representation of their blood oath of vengeance, until only the symbol of the Tyrant of Badab remained. Whereas before the population of the Badab sector had been controlled with inflexible and savage discipline, but were still viewed as a war resource to be maintained and managed, now the Astral Claw's wrath grew ever more arbitrary and brutal as their increasing paranoia and the murderous rages to which Huron was becoming prone took their toll on those unfortunates caught within the Tyrant's domain. On Badab Primaris, for non Astartes to dare to look directly upon the face of one of the Astral Claws was now punishable by blinding, and after an assassin tried to take the life of Huron with his own command chamber, the assailant being slain by the Tyrant himself, non-Space Marines were banned entirely from the precincts of the Palace of Thorns on pain of death. Thousands of civilians were killed in groundless reprisal by the Astral Claw's retaliators. By this point, the mindset of the Astral Claws themselves had succumbed to a siege mentality, for they expected death as now inevitable, but were spurred on by a bleak desire for vengeance against those they believed had wronged them, spite and rage consuming what little remained of their honor. Invasion of Piraeus. Lord High Commander Karab Kholn, having waited as long as he thought was strategically advantageous to gather his forces for a heavy assault, put his plan for the invasion and conquest of the Piraeus system on the edge of the Badab system into action. The Piraeus system had been identified as the key to the subsequent attack on the central Badab system, due in no small part to the relatively stable warp route between the two regions. A plan long in fruition, Cullen had already set up a series of secondary fronts at Isin and Decabalus, where raids and hit-and-run actions by his own Red Scorpions chapter, along with the Minotaurs and Exorcists, had destabilized much of the region and forced the Tyrant of Badab's armies to spread their outer defenses thinly. The initial attack would occur with an Imperial Navy assault to interdict the industrial world of Piraeus V, also known locally as Yaros Station, with a direct Space Marine assault against the lunar colonies on the second moon of Piraeus, Piraeus' dominant gas giant, Kiritas. This attack was to be conducted by the combined forces of the Exorcist and the Red Scorpions chapters, their strike force amounting to an effective strength of 6 Space Marine companies. The majority of Space Marine contingent was made up of fresh reinforcements of the Exorcist chapter, who Lord Commander Cullen had kept in reserve for this closing stage of the war, although overall tactical command of the assault was taken up by Cullen himself. From the start, the invasion of the Piraeus system was subject to reversal and unexpected calamity. As the Loyalist invasion fleet left the Larsa system, one of the Imperial Navy cruisers attached to the force, the Spear of Mendoza, suffered a catastrophic Giller field failure, hurling all on board screaming to their doom in the Materium. Several other ships were either damaged or scattered due to the unexpected turbulence and the usually stable warp routes. This forced the ill-fated fleet to arrive piecemeal at the target's system edge, further out than had been planned. The Loyalist starships were forced to reassemble and operate at maximum thruster burn for a number of solar days to reach the inner worlds of Piraeus, after which time all elements of surprise had been lost. The Loyalist fleet had little choice but to press the attack. The bulk of the Imperial naval ships, led by the Retribution-class battleship, Torn of Blood, broke off to engage the defense fleet and bombard Piraeus V, while the Space Marine strike force diverted the assault to the moon of Kiritas Secundus. A flotilla of planetary assault craft ferrying Astra Militarium and Inquisitorial forces formed the rear echelon intended to consolidate and exploit a successful Astartes attack. Initial enemy resistance in space proved insufficient to slow the attack down, even though the Imperial forces sporadically encountered minefields that were breached or bypassed without loss. The secessionist armada around Piraeus V stood little chance of long delaying, let alone preventing the Loyalist force assembled by Lord High Commander Cullen from their inevitable assault. The fighting above Piraeus V proved particularly fierce, as defense ships flung themselves almost suicidally against their attackers. The Imperial Navy ships, however, were prevented from achieving their secondary objective of close bombardment of Piraeus V, as ground fire from massive emplacements of macro cannon and defense laser batteries on the surface, unpredicted in strength and ferocity, forced the naval ship back. God, that was a long one. Elsewhere in orbit of Kiritas Secundus, despite strong resistance, greater success was found by the Loyalists, and between them the combined might of the Red Scorpion, Sword of Ordon, and the Exorcist, Redeemer, smashed aside the moon's asteroid forts in the short order. Landing zones in the vicinity of the lunar colony's main citadels and generatora stations were quickly identified and subjected to preliminary bombardment before a full-scale planet strike was initiated via Thunderhawk and drop pod assault. On landing, the Red Scorpions and Exorcists were immediately met head-on by the mortal auxilia of the Tyrant's Legion in a strong counteroffensive. Their enemies' numbers increased several-fold by indentured workers, driven on by the use of explosive colors and armed with little more than sharpened tools and crude Promethean bombs. Though the assaulting Space Marines killed the Tyrant's Legion Auxilia and their slave worker allies in droves, their numbers slowed the transhumans' attackers down. preventing them from spreading out to assault their individual targets as planned. It was at this point, when the bulk of the Red Scorpions and the Exorcist chapters were both bottled in their landing zones, that the Astral Claws sprung their trap. Previously silent and long-concealed ground batteries fire from the depths of the alien fortress that covered the moon, striking down Thunderhawks and landing craft and ripping into the Space Marine warships in close orbit above. From within the moon's citadel, cannons and mortars thundered afresh, pelting the loyalist Space Marines with missiles and shell, indiscriminately targeting the battles where their own forces were engaged at close quarters with the loyalists. This was only a heralding barrage, however, and from their concealed bunkers, scores of land raiders, tanks, and rhino transports bearing the insignia of the Tyrant of Badab roared forth. The near chapter strength of the Astral Claws with their master, Huron, leading at the fore, Lord High Commander... there's a pause there. Lord High Commander Cullen and those Space Marines that stood with him were caught between a crossfire from above and the Tyrant below. The Tyrant had long ago divined the importance of the Piraeus system as a keystone in the Badab sector's defense, and drew his own plans accordingly. The presence of a concentration of Astral Claws on Kiritas, and the secret upgrading and cunning deployment of his defenses had not been the whole of the Tyrant's strategy either. And within a solar hour of the hidden guns of Kiritas Secundus opening fire and cutting off the loyalist spearhead from its supporting ships, the Tyrant's own war fleet ripped into real space at the edge of the inner Piraeus system. What was to follow was to be one of the largest and last major fleet engagements of the Badab War. With the final remaining operable battle barge in the Astral Claws fleet, the mighty and storied Seraph of Judgment, the Successionist Armada represented the last exercise of their once vaunted naval power. Outgunned, the senior Imperial Navy Admiral realized that the tactical situation had suddenly shifted, and quickly ascertained that if the Tyrant's fleet could take on two Loyalist forces, both of which had already sustained damage, and expended considerable stocks of their ordnance, separately, they might yet attain a crushing victory. But if fought simultaneously, the Loyalists would be far more evenly matched against them. With communications with the ongoing ground war impossible, it was with a heavy heart that Captain Waiter Ryder, the Exorcist master of the fleet, reluctantly agreed with the Vice Admiral's dire assessment of the situation, and complied with his plan of feigned retreat and rendezvous. With their enemies seemingly in full fight before them, the Successionist fleet ravaged into the inner system at full speed, striking at targets of opportunity such as the ungainly Loyalist rear echelon transports. Thousands of the embarked troops aboard these Imperial transports died as a result. On the planet's surface, savage fighting raged on as the Loyalists and Successionists clashed without mercy. The Astral Claws came on in savage and bitter fury as the Red Scorpions met them with righteous hatred of their own, while the Exorcists displayed their usual unnerving calm in the face of overwhelming force. Lord High Commander Cullen stood at the fore. At his side was Severin Loth, Chief Librarian of the chapter. Huron struck the Exorcist's battle line ferociously, smashing aside Space Marines with contemptuous ease. The Tyrant's blood spattered personal guard poured into the breach behind him, forming a murderous wedge as the Tyrant strove to reach his true and chosen enemy, Karab Colin. Captain Silas Alberic, commander of the Exorcist forces, led the counter-assault force of his chapter's elite Enochian guard to confront the Tyrant head-on and attempt to blunt his attack and prevent the momentum of the battle from shifting at the critical juncture. Instead of being matched with the Tyrant, Silas Alberic found himself in a duel with ancient Claytor, one of the most feared and infamous of the Astral Claw's dreadnoughts. The Exorcist captain suffered a terrible wound, which crushed and crippled his Terminator armor before he was able to disable the dreadnought's motive systems with his master-crafted relic mace, the Hellslayer, felling the great metal beast. As the battle continued to rage, the two chapter masters at last found each other, and Karab Kolon and Huron matched their skill in personal combat. The Tyrant of Badab charged the Red Scorpion chapter master in a fury, bellowing his rage and blaspheming the Emperor bitterly, while Cullen fought in grim silence, concentrating on countering the frenzied blows of the Tyrant's relic Lightning Claw, known as the Ghost Razors, with the ancient heirloom of its chapter, the Blade of the Scorpion. Soon, Cullen was covered in dozens of bleeding wounds. It was at this point, when the two warriors parted the exchange of blows, that Cullen finally spoke, taunting the Tyrant with accusations of his own. Further maddened by these insults, the Tyrant of Badab howled in rage, charging at the Red Scorpion again. But Cullen expected the frenzied attacks, and deftly turned aside, allowing the Tyrant's momentum to take him past. In a blow that would have normally felled even the mightiest of Space Marines, Cullen lashed out with the blade of the Scorpion, and slashed deeply into the Tyrant's side, parting his foe's armor in a welter of blood. But the Tyrant shrugged off his opponent's attack and wheeled around, his claws arching down and the ghostly blades punching through Karab Cullen's breastplate. Only through momental effort was Cullen able to fight on through his agony, hurling himself backwards onto the ground before the Tyrant could close his clawed fingers and rip out his heart. The Red Scorpion then slid down a slope of rubble and armored bodies before the looming Tyrant, whose bitter laugh echoed above him. Cullen staggered once more to his feet, direly wounded as the battle continued to rage around him. Then, suddenly, a new sun burned the heavens, raining destruction down on all below. Gambling on a dangerous plan to extract the forces stranded below, Captain Radar bargained that the planetary defense would be half blinded by the battle raging above them in orbit. The Exorcist battle barge Redeemer was among the least skated, its base filled with capacity with surviving Thunderhawks from across the fleet for the emergency operation. The vast battle barge sliced into Kiritas Secundus' thin atmosphere. The ground batteries proved ineffective against her, as the fire striking all around her shields made the Redeemer appear as a terrible blazing sun in the sky, and the panicked defense crews failed to quickly respond. Librarian Talot of the Exorcist was able to lock in on the bright soul of Severing Loth in the warp, and the familiar spark of his wounded master Alberic, and so the Redeemer made for its intended target. At this unexpected arrival, the Astral Claws were hurled back amid the storm of dust and debris. And below its sky-bolting bulk, the battlefield where Cullen and the Tyrant fought was showered in rubble and flame, parting them before their combat could reach a final conclusion in either's favor. Immediate extraction operations got underway before the enemy could rally to the defense, as the Redeemer's guns rent the ground asunder and pulverized the towers of nearby citadels. In a desperate operation lasting near 2 solar hours, almost 3 and 5 of the Loyalist Space Marines had made planetfall were recovered, although most of them were either casualties or bore some fresh wound or scar to mark the furious combat they had seen. No least of the wounded was Commander Cullen, who was taken up in the care of his chapter's apothecaries. Above Kiritas, battle had once again been joined between the Loyalists and the Successionist warships. The Successionists both outnumbered the Loyalists and outgunned them, but the Loyalists, even though many of their vessels were damaged, had the great number of heavy warships in their line of battle, and were far greater in quality of skilled and disciplined crew. The rebel fleet came on a chaotic and ragged attack column, and this was to prove their undoing, as the combined Imperial Navy and Adeptus Astartes warships formed into tight formation and crossed laterally in an oblique pass on the enemy column, maximizing their broadsides while the Successionists could not fully bring theirs to bear. The star battle was eventually won for the Loyalists, with the death of the Seraph of Judgment, but at a great cost. And there remained a great deal of bloody fighting to do, as the surviving enemy ships were put to flight, or captured in a series of brutal boarding assaults. The invasion of Piraeus was over. Both sides claimed the victory, and both sides tasted defeat. For the Successionists, the Loyalist invaders had been driven off, and not one iota of ground had been surrendered to them. But in doing so, they had gambled the last of their once mighty fleet, and lost it, and with it any hope of maintaining dominion outside of the Badab system itself. Fatalities on both sides had been appalling high, and Lord Commander Cullen had seen his attacking force blunted, and many of his most powerful ships of the line damaged to the extent that might take standard years to repair. The Badab War had arguably been won at Piraeus by the Loyalists, but there was one last battle to fight, and that was likely to be the most terrible of all: the final siege of Badab itself.